Go through me. First, the obese girl blocked the door when the mountain man's enemies came for revenge. The winter of 1818 came early to the Montana Territory, riding down from the mountains on winds sharp enough to cut bone. Jacob Thornwood, known to most simply as the Mountain Man, had chosen this isolation deliberately. His cabin sat tucked against a granite cliff face, surrounded by towering pines that creaked and groaned under the weight of accumulated snow. He'd built it with his own hands 3 years prior, after the war, after everything had fallen apart, after he'd lost any reason to remain among civilized men. The cabin was modest but sturdy, thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone fireplace that drew smoke cleanly, and shuttered windows that could withstand the fiercest blizzards. Inside, the space was sparse, a bed frame lashed together with rawhide, a rough-hewn table, shelves holding dried meat and preserved vegetables, and an array of traps and weapons that spoke to the solitary life he'd chosen. Jacob himself was a figure carved from the wilderness, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad as an axe handle and arms thick with corded muscle earned from years of splitting wood, hauling game, and surviving where softer men perished. His beard, dark as midnight, hung thick and untamed to his chest. His eyes, pale blue, like winter ice, held a hardness that made even other mountain men uneasy. But beneath that granite exterior, beneath the scars and calluses and the carefully maintained distance, there beat a heart capable of unexpected gentleness. He'd demonstrated that gentleness exactly once in the past year, and it had changed everything. It was last spring when he'd found Mary Ann Whitmore stumbling through the woods, half-frozen, sobbing, her dress torn and muddy. She'd run away from Fort Benson. She'd gasped between sobs, run away from the cruel laughter and the daily humiliations, from people who thought her size made her less than human, from a world that had no place for a girl like her. Jacob had brought her to his cabin without a word. He'd given her his bed while he slept on the floor. He'd fed her from his winter stores and asked nothing in return. And when she'd finally stopped crying enough to speak, when she'd told him about the cruelty she'd endured, the names they'd called her, the way even her own family treated her like a burden, the complete absence of kindness in her young life, something in Jacob's chest had cracked open. "You can stay," he'd said simply, "long as you need." That had been 9 months ago. Mary Ann had stayed. She'd made herself useful, learning to tan hides, mend clothes, prepare meals from wild game and foraged plants. She'd learned to read the weather, to identify animal tracks, to move quietly through the forest. But more than that, she'd learned what it felt like to be valued. Jacob never commented on her weight, never made her feel small. He spoke to her with respect, listened when she talked, and slowly, so slowly, she barely noticed it happening, she began to heal. And Jacob, for his part, found that the cabin no longer felt quite so empty. He would never have admitted it aloud, but Mary Ann's presence had become essential to him. Her laughter, when he told dry jokes about stubborn mules, the way she hummed while cooking, the sound of another human voice in the long winter evenings. For the first time since the war, since he'd killed men and watched friends die and lost his faith in humanity, Jacob Thornwood felt almost human again. But the past, he'd learned, never stayed buried for long. The trouble had started 5 years earlier, during the tail end of the War of 1812. Jacob had served as a scout for the American forces, moving through hostile territory, gathering intelligence, and when necessary, eliminating threats with silent efficiency. He'd been good at it, too good. Among the men he'd crossed paths with was a group of renegade soldiers led by a vicious bastard named Silas Cobb. Cobb and his men weren't patriots. They were opportunists, using the chaos of war to enrich themselves through theft, murder, and worse. They'd terrorized frontier settlements, stolen from supply trains, and killed anyone who got in their way, including American soldiers. Jacob had tracked them for 3 weeks through the wilderness. When he'd finally caught up with them, the confrontation had been brutal. Jacob had killed 2 of Cobb's men outright and beaten Silas himself nearly to death, leaving him broken and humiliated in front of his surviving gang. Then Jacob had dragged them to the nearest military outpost, where most had been hanged for desertion and murder. Silas Cobb had escaped the noose due to lack of evidence directly tying him to certain crimes. He'd been dishonorably discharged instead, disappearing into the wild territories with murder in his heart and Jacob Thornwood's name carved into his memory like a curse. That had been 5 years ago. Jacob had assumed Cobb was dead, or at least had moved on. The frontier was vast, after all, and grudges were expensive to maintain. He'd assumed wrong. The pounding on the door came just after midnight. Jacob was instantly awake, years of survival instinct pulling him from sleep to full alertness in a heartbeat. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin interior in deep shadow. Across the room, Mary Ann stirred in her bed, confusion and fear crossing her face. "Jacob?" she whispered. He was already moving, reaching for the long-handled axe mounted above the fireplace. The pounding came again, harder, and with it came voices rough, angry, full of barely restrained violence. "Thornwood!" The voice was ragged, but unmistakable. "Silas Cobb. We know you're in there. You got a debt to settle." Jacob's jaw tightened. He moved to the window, carefully opening the shutter just enough to peer outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least 10 men surrounded the cabin, armed with rifles, knives, and clubs. They carried torches that cast dancing shadows across the snow, turning the peaceful clearing into something hellish. And at their center stood Silas Cobb, older and harder than Jacob remembered, his face twisted with hatred that had festered for 5 long years. "You humiliated me, Thornwood," Cobb shouted. "You cost me my reputation, my position. I've been living like a dog because of you. Now it's time for you to pay." Mary Ann had crept up beside Jacob, her face pale in the dim light. "Who are they?" she breathed. "Men I crossed during the war," Jacob said quietly. His mind was racing, calculating odds. 10 men, possibly more he couldn't see, all armed. Even if he managed to take down 3 or 4 in the initial confrontation, the rest would overwhelm him. If he went out there, he'd die. But if he stayed inside, they'd eventually break through or burn the cabin down around them. "Jacob." Mary Ann's voice was small, frightened. "What do we do?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. This girl who'd found safety in his protection, who'd begun to bloom under simple kindness, who'd brought light back into his dark world. The thought of Cobb's men getting their hands on her made something savage and protective rise up in his chest. "Stay away from the door," he said firmly. "No matter what happens, you stay back." He gripped the axe tighter and moved toward the door. His plan, if it could be called that, was simple. Open the door, hit them hard and fast, create enough chaos that Mary Ann might be able to slip away in the confusion. It was a terrible plan, but it was all he had. His hand was on the door latch when Mary Ann spoke again. "He saved my life." Jacob froze. She wasn't talking to him. Mary Ann had moved past him. She stood directly in front of the door now, her body blocking his path, her hands trembling, but her feet planted firmly. "Mary Ann, get away from there." Jacob's voice was sharp with fear. Outside, Cobb laughed. "You got yourself a woman in there, Thornwood? That's sweet. Maybe after we're done with you, we'll—" "No!" Mary Ann's shout cut through the night like a blade. Her voice, usually so soft and uncertain, rang out with a strength that shocked everyone, Jacob most of all. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of the door as if her body alone could hold back the violence waiting outside. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice didn't waver. "Muon vau the pai buok qua toi truok." The Vietnamese words came from some deep place inside her, something she'd heard from a traveling merchant's wife months ago, a phrase that had stuck in her memory because of the fierce courage behind it. And then, in English, louder, "Go through me first." Silence fell outside. Even the wind seemed to pause. Jacob stared at her back, at the way her shoulders shook, at the impossible courage of this girl who'd been broken by the world standing between him and death. His throat tightened. "Mary Ann," his voice cracked, "please step aside." She shook her head violently. "No." Outside, confusion rippled through Cobb's men. One of them spoke up, uncertain. "Boss, there's a woman." "I heard her, you idiot," Cobb snarled. "Girl, this ain't your fight. Move, and you won't get hurt." Mary Ann sucked in a shaking breath. Then she shouted through the door, her voice breaking with emotion, but somehow growing stronger with every word. "He saved my life. When I had nothing, when everyone else turned their backs, he gave me shelter. He gave me food. He treated me like a human being." She pressed her forehead against the door, tears flowing freely now. "He's the only person in this entire world who's ever shown me kindness, the only one who's ever made me feel like I matter. And if you want to hurt him—" Her voice rose to something fierce, something that came from a well of courage she'd never known she possessed. "You'll have to kill me too." The words echoed across the clearing and up into the dark trees. Inside the cabin, Jacob felt something break apart in his chest. His vision blurred. In all his years through war, through violence, through the savage loneliness of the frontier, no one had ever stood for him. No one had ever valued his life enough to risk their own. He'd spent so long believing he was nothing more than a weapon, a tool, something useful, but fundamentally unworthy of love or loyalty. And here was this girl, this brave, beautiful girl, willing to die for him. His hands began to shake. The axe suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "Mary Ann," he whispered, his voice raw, "why would you—" But she didn't turn. She kept her body pressed against the door, kept her voice strong as she called out again, "He's a good man, better than any of you, and I won't let you touch him." Outside, the men shifted uncomfortably. Another voice spoke up. "Cobb, I ain't comfortable with this. Ain't right to hurt a woman." "She's got more spine than all of you combined," muttered another. "Shut up!" Cobb's voice was venomous, but even he seemed thrown by Mary Ann's stand. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind and crackling torches. Then Cobb spat into the snow. "Fine, if that's how she wants it. Boys, grab her, pull her out of the way, and then we finish Thornwood." The door exploded inward. 3 of Cobb's men rushed through the shattered doorway, reaching for Mary Ann with rough hands. She screamed, but stood her ground, trying desperately to hold the doorframe. And that's when Jacob Thornwood moved. The change that came over him was terrifying. All the careful control, all the measured restraint he'd maintained for 3 years of peaceful solitude, it all shattered. What emerged was the warrior he'd tried to bury, the killer he'd hoped to leave behind, but this time driven not by duty or survival, but by something far more powerful, love. The first man through the door never saw Jacob coming. The axe handle caught him across the temple, and he dropped like a stone. The second man got his hands on Mary Ann's arm. Jacob grabbed him by the collar and threw him bodily back through the doorway, where he crashed into 2 other men and sent them all sprawling into the snow. The third man drew a knife. Jacob caught his wrist, twisted, and the sickening crack of breaking bone echoed through the cabin. The man's scream was cut short as Jacob's fist caught him in the solar plexus, driving every bit of air from his lungs. "Mary Ann, get back!" Jacob roared. She stumbled away from the door, eyes wide, as Jacob stepped into the doorway. He filled it completely, his massive frame silhouetted against the firelight, his face terrible in its fury. "You want me, Cobb?" His voice was quiet now, deadly quiet. "Here I am, but you lay one finger on that girl, and I swear by everything holy I'll kill every last one of you." Cobb's men had regrouped, but they hesitated. They'd expected an easy revenge, a quick kill. They hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the mountain man fighting not for himself, but for someone else, hadn't expected the raw, protective violence radiating from him. Cobb's face twisted with rage and frustration. "You think you can take all of us? You're one man." Jacob smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Try me." They tried. What followed was brutal chaos. The men rushed forward, and Jacob met them at the threshold. His axe rose and fell with terrible efficiency. He used his size and strength ruthlessly, using the narrow doorway to ensure they could only come at him 1 or 2 at a time. One man swung a club. Jacob deflected it with the axe handle and drove his elbow into the man's face, shattering his nose. Another tried to tackle him. Jacob absorbed the impact, pivoted, and hurled the man into the doorframe so hard the logs cracked. They came with knives, with rifles used as clubs, with desperate fury. Jacob gave them no quarter. Blood splattered the snow. Men screamed and fell back, clutching broken arms, shattered ribs, ruined faces. But he was taking damage too. A knife sliced across his ribs. A club caught his shoulder, sending jolts of pain down his arm. He was slowing down, and then Cobb himself stepped forward, drawing a long hunting knife, his face savage with hatred. "Should have killed you 5 years ago, Thornwood. Won't make that mistake twice." He came in low and fast, and Jacob, exhausted, bleeding, fighting off 6 other men, almost didn't see it in time. Almost. At the last second, he twisted, and the knife that should have buried itself in his heart instead carved a burning line across his chest. He gasped, stumbled backward, and Mary Ann was there. She'd picked up a heavy iron skillet from beside the fireplace, and she swung it with all the strength of desperation and love, catching Cobb square across the side of his head. The impact made a sound like a bell tolling. Cobb went down hard, blood pouring from his scalp, eyes rolled back. He didn't move. The remaining men froze, staring at their fallen leader, then at the girl holding the skillet like a weapon, then at the bleeding mountain man who looked ready to tear them all apart with his bare hands despite his injuries. One of them, A younger man with fear stark in his eyes dropped his rifle. "I'm done. This ain't worth dying for." "He's right," said another, backing away. "Cobb's grudge, not ours. We're leaving." One by one they retreated, some helping wounded comrades, others simply fleeing into the darkness. Within moments, the clearing was empty, except for Cobb's unconscious form, which his men dragged away as they vanished into the night. Silence returned, broken only by Jacob's ragged breathing and the crackle of the dying fire. Jacob stood in the doorway for a long moment, swaying slightly, the axe still gripped in his hand. Blood seeped through his shirt from multiple wounds. His knuckles were split and raw. Every breath brought sharp pain from bruised or broken ribs. Then Mary Ann's voice, small and terrified. "Jacob?" He turned. She was still holding the skillet, her eyes huge in her pale face, tears streaming down her cheeks. The reality of what had just happened, the violence, the blood, how close they'd both come to death, was crashing down on her. The axe slipped from Jacob's fingers and thudded to the floor. He took one step toward her, then another, and then his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees. "Mary Ann," he breathed, and his voice was raw with pain and wonder and something he couldn't name. "Why? Why would you risk your life for me?" She dropped the skillet and rushed to him, falling to her knees before him, her hands hovering over his wounds, uncertain where to touch, desperate to help. "Because you think you're alone in this world," she said, her voice breaking. "But you're not anymore." Tears blurred Jacob's vision. His hands, still shaking from battle, reached up to cup her face. "I'm not worth dying for." "Yes, you are," she said fiercely. "You're worth everything." And then she was pulling him into her arms, and he was letting her, this girl who was so much braver than he'd ever been, this girl who'd seen him at his most violent and hadn't flinched away, this girl who'd stood between him and death without hesitation. He buried his face against her shoulder and felt something inside him, something hard and cold that he'd carried for years, finally begin to thaw. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry you had to—" "Stop," she said firmly. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes. "You protected me, just like you've been protecting me since the day we met. I'm not sorry. I'm proud, and I'd do it again." Jacob stared at her, at this girl who'd been broken by the world's cruelty and had somehow found the strength to stand against violence itself, at this girl who'd shown him what courage really looked like. "Mary Ann," he said softly, I think I love you." Her breath caught. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time they were different. These weren't tears of fear or pain. "I know I love you," she whispered back. "I have for months. I never thought you could feel the same." Jacob laughed then, a rough, broken sound. "How could I not? You're the bravest person I've ever met. Your sunlight and warmth and everything good that I thought had been burned out of the world. You're—" She kissed him. It was soft and tentative and perfect, and when they finally pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. "We should probably deal with your wounds," Mary Ann said eventually, her practical nature reasserting itself even as she smiled through her tears. "Probably," Jacob agreed, but neither of them moved for a long moment, content just to hold each other in the firelight, alive and together and safe. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, both physical and emotional. Mary Ann tended Jacob's wounds with surprising skill, cleaning and binding the cuts, making poultices from herbs she'd learned to identify in the forest, sitting up with him through the worst of the pain. The knife wound across his ribs was the worst of it, but under her care even that began to close cleanly. As his body healed, something else healed too, the walls he'd built around his heart. They talked, really talked, in a way they never had before. Jacob told her about the war, about the things he'd done, about the man he'd been and the man he'd tried to become. She listened without judgment, her hand held firmly in his, and Mary Ann told him about her life before the cabin, about growing up feeling like a burden, about the cruel comments and casual cruelties, about running away and nearly dying in the wilderness before he'd found her. "I thought I'd rather freeze to death than go back to that life," she admitted quietly one evening as they sat by the fire. "Death seemed kinder than another day of being treated like I was worthless." Jacob's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You were never worthless. Anyone who made you feel that way was a fool." She leaned into him. "I know that now, because of you." As winter gradually gave way to early spring, their relationship deepened. The love that had been declared in desperate circumstances blossomed in the peaceful domesticity of their shared life. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's preferences, the small intimacies that turn a house into a home. Jacob taught Mary Ann to shoot, patiently correcting her stance, praising her improving accuracy. She taught him to cook properly, transforming his utilitarian meals into something approaching delicious. They worked together to repair the cabin door, to split wood for the next winter, to prepare the small garden plot Mary Ann wanted to plant. And in the evenings, they sat together watching the fire, talking or simply enjoying comfortable silence, her head on his shoulder, his hand holding hers, both of them marveling at how life could shift so dramatically from darkness to light. When the mountain snows finally melted and the first wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, Jacob made a decision. "Mary Ann," he said one morning as they stood outside the cabin, watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold and pink, "I need to go into Fort Benson." She stiffened slightly. Fort Benson was where she'd fled from, where memories of humiliation still lived. "Why?" "Because I need to speak to the preacher," Jacob said quietly. He took both her hands in his and turned to face her. "Because I want to do this properly. Because I want to marry you, Mary Ann Whitmore, and I want the whole world to know that you're mine and I'm yours." Her eyes went wide. "Jacob, I know marriage might not mean much to you," he continued, his voice urgent now, needing her to understand. "I know the world hasn't given you much reason to trust in any of that, but I want to stand up in front of God and everybody and make promises to you. I want to promise that I'll protect you, provide for you, cherish you for the rest of my life. I want—" "Yes," she interrupted, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes." He swept her up into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed, both of them giddy with joy and the promise of future happiness. They traveled to Fort Benson 2 weeks later. Jacob had been worried about Mary Ann's reaction to returning, but she surprised him. She walked through the settlement with her head high, her hand firmly clasped in his, no longer the broken, frightened girl who'd fled 9 months earlier. People stared. Some whispered. But when they saw the way the mountain man looked at her with tenderness and fierce protectiveness and unmistakable love, the whispers changed their nature. And when Mary Ann met their gazes calmly, smiling slightly, clearly happy and whole in a way she'd never been before, some of those who'd been cruel to her felt something like shame. The preacher, a kindly man named Reverend Michaels, agreed to perform the ceremony. It took place a week later in the small log church, with a handful of townspeople attending, some out of curiosity, some out of genuine goodwill. Jacob stood at the altar in the cleanest clothes he owned, his beard newly trimmed, his hands trembling slightly as he waited. And when Mary Ann walked down the aisle in a simple dress she'd sewn herself, her face glowing with happiness, Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. The vows were simple and traditional, but when Jacob said, "I do," his voice rang with absolute conviction. And when Mary Ann repeated the words, tears of joy streaming down her face, everyone present could feel the truth of it. This was not a marriage of convenience or necessity, but one of genuine, hard-won love. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Mary Ann with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance found themselves wiping away tears. They spent one night at the fort's boarding house, Jacob's wedding gift to his bride, a night of relative luxury before heading back to the cabin, to the life they'd built together in the wilderness. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Jacob and Mary Ann built a life together in the mountains, expanding the cabin, adding a proper smokehouse and a larger garden. They weathered harsh winters and celebrated brief summers. They worked hard, side by side, building something lasting. Mary Ann bloomed in the security of Jacob's love. Her confidence grew. She became skilled at all the tasks required for frontier life and discovered talents she'd never known she possessed. She learned to cure hides beautifully, creating leather goods that they could trade at the fort for supplies they couldn't make themselves. She developed a green thumb, coaxing vegetables and herbs from the rocky soil. Jacob, for his part, became gentler. The hard edges that had defined him for so long softened. He laughed more easily. He talked more freely. With Mary Ann beside him, the cabin that had once been a place of solitude became a genuine home, filled with warmth and laughter and love. In their second year of marriage, Mary Ann became pregnant. Jacob's reaction to the news was a study in contrasts, terror and joy warring on his face in equal measure. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted that night, holding her close. "You didn't know how to love anyone either," Mary Ann said gently, placing his large hand on her still flat belly. "But you figured that out just fine." Their daughter was born on a crisp autumn morning, delivered with the help of a midwife they'd brought from Fort Benson. The labor was long and difficult, and Jacob paced outside the cabin like a caged animal, terrified he might lose the two people who meant everything to him. But Mary Ann was stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for. And when the baby's first cry split the morning air, Jacob burst into the cabin to find his wife exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny, perfect infant. "She's beautiful," he breathed, kneeling beside the bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he gently touched his daughter's tiny hand. The baby gripped his finger with surprising strength, and Jacob felt something slot into place in his soul. "What should we name her?" Mary Ann asked softly. Jacob looked at his wife, this woman who'd stood between him and death, who'd loved him when he was convinced he was unlovable, who'd given him a family when he'd thought himself destined to die alone. "Hope," he said quietly. "Her name is Hope." Mary Ann smiled. Perfect. 5 years later, on a warm summer evening, Jacob Thornwood stood outside his cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The cabin was larger now, with a proper second room for their daughter, and smoke rose lazily from the chimney. From inside came the sound of laughter, Mary Ann and Hope playing some game that involved a great deal of giggling. The sound made Jacob smile, a deep contentment settling over him like a warm blanket. He thought back to that terrible winter night when Silas Cobb had come for revenge, when everything had hung in the balance. He thought about Mary Ann standing at that door, terrified but resolute, choosing to risk everything for him. That night had changed both of them irrevocably. It had cracked open something in Jacob that he'd thought permanently closed, and it had revealed Mary Ann's incredible strength to both of them. The door opened behind him, and Mary Ann emerged, holding Hope's hand. Their daughter, who had Jacob's blue eyes and Mary Ann's gentle spirit, was chattering about something she'd seen in the woods earlier, a deer, or maybe an elk. Jacob couldn't quite follow the excited 5-year-old logic. Mary Ann caught his eye and smiled that smile that still, after all these years, made his heart skip. She was beautiful in the fading light, her face peaceful and happy, no trace remaining of the broken girl he'd found in the woods. "Dinner's ready," she said. "Papa, come eat," Hope demanded, tugging at his hand. Jacob let himself be pulled toward the cabin, toward warmth and food and family, toward a life he'd never imagined possible. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at the mountains, at the wilderness that had once been his refuge and was now simply home. Mary Ann touched his arm. "What are you thinking about?" He turned to her, cupping her face gently in his calloused hands, looking into the eyes of the woman who'd saved him in every way a person could be saved. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man alive," he said quietly, "and that I love you more than words can say." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "I love you too. Now come inside before the stew gets cold." As they entered the cabin together, Hope already climbing into her chair and chattering about her day, Jacob felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The ghosts of his past no longer haunted him. The violence that had once defined him was just a distant memory. Here, in this cabin in the mountains, with his wife and daughter beside him, Jacob Thornwood had finally found what he'd been searching for all his life without knowing it. He'd found home. He'd found love. He'd found redemption. And it had all begun with a girl brave enough to stand in a doorway and shout into the darkness, "Go through me first." That courage had saved them both. And in saving each other, they'd built something beautiful, a life, a family, a love that would endure for all their days. As night fell over the Montana wilderness, the Thornwood family sat together at their table, sharing a meal, sharing laughter, sharing the warmth of a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for it. And in the years to come, when Hope was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story of how her parents fell in love, a story of courage and protection, of standing firm against darkness, of choosing love even when it seemed impossible. It was a story worth telling, a story worth remembering, a story that proved that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stand in a doorway and refuse to move, protecting what matters most with nothing but fierce, unshakable love.